Teaser. I sent one photo to our family group chat, my 7-year-old daughter Zuri, lying pale and unconscious behind the ICU glass after a life-threatening complication during heart surgery. She wants to see you when she wakes up, I wrote. My brother Jamal answered with 2 words, busy. Handle it. My mother Yvonne followed with, she lived. Stop making her our problem. Chloe complained that my hospital messages were interrupting her champagne toast. I stared at the screen until the words stopped hurting typed. It's okay, and wiped my face. They thought that was surrender. It was not. By 10 o'clock that night, the same people who could not spare 5 minutes for a sick child would be standing beneath a giant projector at a $150,000 vow renewal watching my face appear on national television. And before the broadcast ended, the fake empire they had built with money stolen from me would begin collapsing in front of everyone they had spent years trying to impress. If you have ever been forced to build in silence because the people closest to you chose not to see your worth, stay with me. This is how I finally handled it. Segment 1. The Cold Waiting Room. My name is Kiara and I am 33 years old. I was standing in the freezing, sterile hallway of Atlanta General Hospital. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed above me as nurses rushed in and out of the pre-op bay. My 7-year-old Zuri was lying on a narrow hospital bed looking so incredibly small. She was about to undergo a high-risk cardiac procedure that we had been dreading for months. Her tiny hand squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. She looked up at me with tears welling in her brown eyes and asked if her grandmother was coming to see her before she went to sleep. My heart shattered into a million pieces right there on the linoleum floor. I forced the brightest smile I could manage, swallowing the massive lump of terror in my throat. I smoothed her natural curls back from her forehead and promised her that I was going to call her grandmother right now. I stepped out of the bay and walked down the quiet corridor, clutching my phone like it was my only lifeline. I dialed my mother Yvonne. I needed her desperately. I just wanted my mom to hold me and tell me everything was going to be all right while a team of surgeons literally opened up my child's chest. Yvonne answered on the 4th ring. Immediately I could hear heavy background noise. There were glasses clinking and people laughing loudly. I took a shaky breath and told her that Zuri was going into surgery in 10 minutes, and we were terrified. I begged her to come to the hospital just for a little while to sit with me. My mother let out a loud, exasperated sigh directly into the receiver. She told me I was being incredibly selfish with my timing. She complained that the luxury caterers for my brother Jamal's vow renewal party were running late and she was too stressed to deal with my negativity. Jamal and his white wife Chloe were hosting a massive $150,000 vow renewal that evening. They invited half of the Atlanta elite to a country club just to show off wealth that they did not actually own. My mother yelled at me over the phone saying I knew how important this day was for Jamal's networking and I was deliberately trying to ruin his big event with my medical drama. She said Zuri was in a hospital surrounded by top doctors, so she was perfectly fine. She told me to grow up, stop being dramatic, and handle my own life. Then she hung up on me. I stood in the hospital corridor listening to the dial tone. A cold, familiar sting of rejection washed over me. That was my mother. That was the toxic dynamic I had endured my entire life. Jamal was always the untouchable golden child who could do no wrong. He was the supposedly successful real estate mogul, living in a sprawling mansion and driving imported cars. I was just the designated family scapegoat. They viewed me as nothing more than a struggling single mother whose problems were a constant inconvenience to their flawless public image. They never respected my ambition or my intelligence. To them, I was just a failure who was always asking for too much. But Zuri was still inside that room, terrified and asking for her family. She loved her Uncle Jamal, against every instinct telling me to protect my own peace. I pulled out my phone and decided to text him directly. I swallowed my pride for my daughter. I typed out a message pleading with him to just drop by the hospital for 10 short minutes before his luxury party started. I told him Zuri was asking for him, and I just wanted him to give his niece a quick hug before they put her under anesthesia. I watched the delivery notification pop up on the screen and waited. My phone buzzed almost immediately. It was not a message of love or support. Jamal texted that Chloe was having a complete mental breakdown because her designer botched the intricate beading on her custom gown. He wrote that his wife was crying hysterically in the bridal suite, and my depressing texts were ruining the positive vibe of their luxury anniversary day. He actually typed the exact words telling me to stop bothering them and handle it myself. He told me to stop acting like a perpetual victim because my constant crises were making Chloe deeply uncomfortable. I kept staring at Jamal's message long after the screen dimmed. The temptation to argue with him was almost automatic. For years that had been the pattern. They hurt me. I explained why it hurt, and then they used my explanation as proof that I was dramatic. I could already imagine the answer if I called again. Yvonne would tell me I was jealous of Jamal's celebration. Jamal would say I was creating another crisis because I could not stand seeing him happy. Chloe would turn my daughter's fear into an inconvenience that needed to be muted. So I did something I had almost never done with them before. I stopped pleading. I slipped the phone into my pocket and went back to Zuri. A nurse was checking the lines at her wrist, while another reviewed the consent forms with me one final time. I signed where she pointed, answered questions I could barely hear over the pounding in my ears, and kept my voice calm because Zuri was watching my face for clues. She needed to believe I believed she would come back to me. I bent down, kissed her forehead, and told her I would be right outside when she woke up. She asked again whether Grandma or Uncle Jamal might still come. I told her not to worry about anybody except herself. That answer hurt more than I let her see. The nurse began rolling her bed toward the surgical doors. I walked beside it until the red line on the floor marked the point where family had to stop. Zuri held my fingers until the last possible second. When her hand slipped out, I felt the entire world narrow to the sound of wheels, the fluorescent lights, and the doors closing between us. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never again measure my daughter's worth by whether Yvonne or Jamal chose to show up. Suddenly loud alarms started blaring from Zuri's room. The shrill sound echoed down the hallway, piercing through my memories. A team of frantic nurses rushed past me, pushing a heavy crash cart through the double doors. The head doctor shouted that her blood pressure was dropping dangerously low, and they had to move her into the operating room immediately. I pressed my trembling hands against the cold glass doors as they wheeled her bed away down the long corridor. I watched my tiny, beautiful baby girl disappear behind the swinging surgical doors, completely unsure if I would ever see her open her eyes again. I was completely alone. Nobody from my bloodline came to hold my hand. Nobody cared if my child survived or not. I walked slowly over to the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the empty waiting room and sat down. The silence in the hospital wing was suffocating. It pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I wiped the hot tears from my face with the back of my hand. I was entirely done crying over people who only saw me as an obstacle. I sat down because my knees would no longer hold me. The black folder on my lap looked ordinary enough beside the hospital forms, but it was not. I had carried it into Atlanta General because this day had two possible endings, and I had prepared for both. The left side contained everything the doctors needed from me as Zuri's mother. The right side contained documents Jamal had never seen, signatures he had never questioned, and obligations he assumed no one would ever be strong enough to enforce. I did not open that side yet. I only rested my palm over the cover and listened to the operating room doors settle back into silence. My brother had told me to handle my own life. He had no idea how thoroughly I had learned to do exactly that. Segment 2. The Stolen Foundation. I stood completely still in the freezing hospital corridor, my eyes fixed on the heavy metal doors of the operating room where they had just taken my 7-year-old daughter. The bright red surgical light glowing above the entrance felt like a glaring warning sign, mocking my absolute helplessness. Every rational thought in my mind had been stripped away the second Zuri let go of my hand, leaving me hollow and terrified. But as I backed away from those doors and sank into an uncomfortable plastic waiting room chair, a different kind of survival instinct kicked in. I reached into my worn leather tote bag, brushing past the crumpled tissues and medical pamphlets until my fingers wrapped around the cold aluminum chassis of my laptop. I pulled it out and rested it on my trembling knees. Taking a deep, ragged breath, I flipped the screen open and watched the backlit keyboard glow to life. I was not just a grieving, helpless single mother, sitting alone in a pediatric ward while her family partied across town. I was Kiara, the chief executive officer and founder of a stealth health tech holding company that had spent the last 4 years operating in absolute secrecy. I bypassed the standard login screens, accessing a heavily encrypted private server that only 2 people in the entire world even knew existed. As the complex financial dashboards materialized across my screen in sharp, contrasting colors, my posture straightened and my trembling hands went completely still. The numbers scrolling past my eyes represented thousands of hours of relentless, exhausting labor, but I was not looking at our current revenue projections or our pending acquisition deals. I navigated straight to a hidden archival folder buried deep within the system. I clicked on a specific file, one I had kept saved and backed up in multiple locations since the very day my life fell apart. A high-resolution scanned image of a bank transfer document loaded onto the screen. It was dated exactly 4 years ago. I stared at the bottom right corner of the document, letting my eyes burn into the dark blue ink of the signature scrawled across the authorization line. It was my name, but the handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. Yvonne had always looped her vowels with a very specific, aggressive slant. Seeing that forgery again brought the bitter, acidic taste of betrayal rushing back to the back of my throat. That single piece of paper represented the exact moment my own family decided my survival was completely irrelevant. It was the authorization form that drained the $250,000 life insurance policy my late grandmother had left specifically for me, intended to ensure Zuri and I would never have to struggle in this harsh world without proper support. The memory of that awful afternoon washed over me with crystal clarity. I remembered standing in the center of my mother's immaculate kitchen, clutching the mailed bank statement I had just opened. Zuri was only 3 years old at the time, sitting on the hardwood floor, playing with a cheap plastic toy, completely unaware that her entire financial safety net had been ripped away. I confronted Yvonne, my voice cracking with desperation, asking how she could possibly forge my signature and steal the money my grandmother meant for us. My mother did not even look up from the vegetables she was chopping. She calmly told me that the family needed to consolidate resources and that boys required more financial backing to become strong providers. Jamal was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a glass of expensive bourbon, wearing a sharply tailored suit he had bought with my stolen inheritance. When I turned to him, begging him to return the funds because Zuri was already showing signs of a severe heart condition, he just threw his head back and laughed. It was a cold, dismissive laugh that echoed off the granite countertops. He looked me up and down, sneering at my faded clothes, and told me I was just going to waste the cash on some stupid tech startup idea that would inevitably fail. He swirled the bourbon in his glass and said he was building a massive luxury real estate empire, a real legacy that would elevate our family name in Atlanta high society. He told me to stop whining, get a second job, and be grateful he was willing to carry the burden of making our family rich. Chloe, his white girlfriend at the time, sat next to him, filing her nails, rolling her eyes, and muttering that I was acting incredibly ghetto over a simple family loan. They took everything from me, leaving me utterly destitute with a sick toddler, and then they had the audacity to call me selfish for crying about it. The aftermath of that single theft dictated every waking moment of my life from that point forward. I had to watch my daughter grow weaker, her small body struggling to keep up with the other children at the local park, while my brother posted videos of his new yacht on social media. I sold everything of value I owned, downgraded to a dangerous neighborhood, and poured every ounce of my remaining energy into learning complex healthcare billing systems. I realized that the medical industry was a broken, fragmented mess, and I knew exactly how to build the artificial intelligence architecture required to fix it. I coded deep into the night, sitting on a mattress on the floor, listening to Zuri struggle to breathe in her sleep. That stolen inheritance was supposed to be our safety net, but losing it became the relentless fuel that forged my absolute determination. I was never going to rely on those toxic, selfish people again. I would destroy them. I snapped back to the present reality of the sterile hospital waiting room, the hum of the fluorescent lights pulling me out of the painful flashback. I stared at the forged signature on my screen one last time before closing the document window. I had spent 4 grueling years using my background in financial analysis to build my company from absolute scratch, working 18-hour days in a cramped, unheated apartment, while Jamal used my stolen money to fund his fake luxury lifestyle. He bought imported cars, threw lavish parties, and married Chloe in a ceremony that cost more than Zuri's initial medical treatments. But he was careless, arrogant, and entirely incompetent at actually running a business. He had spent the last 18 months taking out massive high-interest commercial loans to cover his failing properties, completely unaware that my holding company was the anonymous entity quietly buying up every single one of his defaulted debts. Suddenly, my phone vibrated intensely against the plastic armrest of my chair, startling me. I picked it up and saw a new encrypted message from Tasha, my best friend, business partner, and chief operating officer. She had been monitoring the final legal transfers from our corporate office downtown. I opened the message and read the words that I had been waiting 4 agonizing years to see. Tasha wrote, "The final debt acquisition is officially complete. The ink is dry. We own him, Kiara." I read Tasha's message 3 times, letting the profound magnitude of her words settle deep into my bones. Every single asset under Jamal's name, his commercial real estate portfolio, the heavily leveraged mortgage on his personal mansion, the luxury cars he leased under the company name, and the massive debt tied to the prestigious country club venue where he was currently hosting his vow renewal, now legally belonged entirely to me. We held the power to liquidate his entire life with a single phone call. He was standing in a ballroom right now, toasting to his brilliance and wealth, completely oblivious to the fact that his empire was a house of cards I had already knocked over. A slow, chilling sense of vindication began to replace the anxiety in my chest. I drafted a quick reply to Tasha, telling her to prepare the immediate foreclosure notices and have the corporate legal team ready for my signal. But before I could hit send, the heavy metal doors of the surgical wing slammed open with a terrifying, violent crash. I jerked my head up, dropping my phone onto my lap. A surgical nurse sprinted out into the hallway, her scrub stained and her face pale with absolute panic. She looked wildly around the empty corridor before her eyes locked onto mine. She yelled my name, her voice echoing off the sterile walls, telling me I needed to come with her right this second, because Zuri's blood pressure was dropping dangerously low and her heart was failing on the operating table. The entire world seemed to suddenly stop spinning as I threw my heavy laptop aside and ran blindly toward the frantic nurse, my own fragile heart shattering into a million jagged pieces of pure, unfiltered terror. Segment 3. The Group Chat Incident. I ran blindly through the swinging doors, pushing past the startled nurses until my hands hit the cold glass window of the intensive care unit. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at the scene unfolding inside the room. Zuri was completely surrounded by doctors and surgical staff working frantically over her small body. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was erratic and terrifying, echoing down the empty hallway like a countdown. I pressed my forehead against the glass, whispering prayers to a god I hoped was listening, begging the universe not to take my only reason for breathing. I watched as Dr. Sterling barked orders, pointing at the monitors, while nurses adjusted the flow of intravenous fluids going into my daughter's arms. Every single second felt like an eternity, stretching out into a massive dark void of absolute panic. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the frantic movement inside the room finally began to slow down. The erratic beeping settled into a steady, stable rhythm. I collapsed against the wall, sliding down until I hit the cold linoleum floor, burying my face in my hands. Dr. Sterling walked out of the heavy doors a few minutes later, pulling down his surgical mask. His face was drawn and exhausted, but he offered me a tight, reassuring smile. He knelt down beside me and told me that Zuri experienced a severe complication when her heart struggled to handle the transition off the bypass machine, but they managed to stabilize her. He looked me directly in the eyes and told me that the next 2 hours were absolutely critical. If she could maintain her blood pressure through this exact window, she would make a full recovery, but she was incredibly fragile right now. I thanked him with a trembling voice, pulling myself up from the floor. I walked over to the glass window again and looked at my beautiful, brave little girl. She was so pale and tiny, engulfed by the massive hospital bed and the tangles of medical tubing. The sheer vulnerability of that moment broke down every single emotional wall I had built over the past 4 years. Despite the theft, despite the constant mockery, despite the brutal phone call with my mother earlier that afternoon, a desperate, pathetic part of my inner child just wanted her family. I wanted my mother to walk down that hallway and wrap her arms around me. I wanted my brother to step up and protect us. I wanted them to realize that this little girl was their blood, and she almost died on an operating table today, driven by a sudden, overwhelming wave of desperate vulnerability. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I opened my camera app and pressed it against the glass, taking a clear picture of Zuri lying unconscious in the intensive care unit bed. I opened our family group chat, which was ironically named Family First. I attached the photo and stared at the blinking cursor. I poured every ounce of my broken heart into that message. I typed out that Zuri just coded on the table and we almost lost her. I begged them to look at the picture. I typed, "Please, she is asking for you guys when she wakes up. Please just come for 5 minutes before your party. I do not care about the money or the past. Just please be here for her." I hit send and watched the message bubble pop up on the screen beneath the heartbreaking photo of my daughter. I stood there in the freezing hallway holding my breath, watching the tiny read receipts appear at the bottom of the screen. They had seen it. They had all seen the image of a 7-year-old girl fighting for her life. Surely this would be the moment their humanity kicked in. Surely seeing her hooked up to life support would snap them out of their selfish delusions. The first reply popped up on my screen. It was from Jamal. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask if she was okay. He simply typed 2 words. Busy, handle it. I stared at the screen, feeling a physical punch to my gut. He was standing in a luxury country club surrounded by floral arrangements paid for with my stolen inheritance, and he could not even spare 5 minutes for his dying niece. Before I could even process the cruelty of his text, a second notification chimed. It was from my mother, Yvonne. She had seen the picture of her own granddaughter fighting for her life, and her response was completely devoid of a single ounce of empathy. She typed, "She lived. Stop making her our problem. We are trying to celebrate your brother today. Do not ruin this for him." My vision blurred as hot, angry tears welled up in my eyes. I felt like I was suffocating. But the final, crushing blow came 10 seconds later. A new message appeared from Chloe Jamal's white wife. She did not even try to hide her absolute disdain for me and my daughter. She explicitly complained about my message interrupting her luxury experience. She typed, "Kiara, your depressing hospital pictures are literally making my phone buzz during my champagne toast. Stop ruining my special day and handle your own kid." I stood frozen in the quiet hospital corridor, clutching my phone as the words burned themselves into my brain. Busy, handle it. She lived. Stop making her our problem. Stop ruining my champagne toast. They were not just dismissive. They were actively cruel. They were annoyed that my child's near-death experience was vibrating their phones while they drank expensive alcohol on my dime. In that exact moment, the final fragile thread tethering me to my toxic biological family snapped completely. The desperate little girl inside me, who just wanted her mother to love her, died right there on the hospital floor. She was instantly replaced by something entirely different. I slowly typed 2 words into the group chat. "It is okay." I hit send and watched the bubble appear. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I reached up and methodically wiped the tears from my cheeks with the back of my hands. The crushing sorrow that had been choking me for hours completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, dark, calculating fury that settled deep into the marrow of my bones. I looked through the glass at Zuri one more time, promising her silently that she would never have to beg these people for love ever again. I was done being the victim. I was done being the scapegoat. I was the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar empire, and I was going to burn their fake kingdom to the ground. The sound of sharp, confident footsteps echoing down the sterile hallway pulled my attention away from the glass. I turned around to see Tasha walking toward me. She looked absolutely breathtaking and fiercely intimidating. She was wearing a sharp-tailored crimson power suit, her natural hair perfectly styled, moving with the undeniable authority of a woman who commanded boardrooms. Flanking her on either side were four men in immaculate dark suits, carrying heavy leather briefcases. It was my elite, corporate legal team. They walked through the pediatric wing like an invading army parting the sea of doctors and nurses who stopped to stare at the unexpected display of absolute corporate power. Tasha stopped right in front of me. Her dark eyes scanned my face, taking in my tear-stained cheeks and the cold, hard resolve that had completely hardened my features. She knew me better than anyone in the world. She knew exactly what I had endured to build this company from the ground up while raising a sick child, and she knew exactly what my family had done to me. She did not offer me a hug or a sympathetic smile because she knew I did not need comfort anymore. I needed war. She handed me a sleek black tablet displaying the final signed legal documents of our hostile debt acquisition. She looked me dead in the eyes, her voice steady and echoing with absolute finality. CNN is ready for the 10 p.m. broadcast, she said. Are we doing this? I looked at the legal team standing behind her, ready to execute my orders. I looked back at Tasha, feeling the immense weight of the empire we had built in the shadows. We were holding the detonator to Jamal's entire life, and my mother was about to watch her precious golden boy lose everything on national television. I reached out and took the tablet from Tasha's hands, feeling the cold metal against my palms. Yes, I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. We are doing this. Tell the network I am ready to go live. I handed the tablet back to Tasha and gave a firm nod to the legal team standing behind her. I told them to set up the broadcasting equipment in the hospital press room. Immediately, I instructed the lead attorney to have the foreclosure notices printed, sorted, and ready for immediate delivery. I wanted the eviction papers for Jamal's commercial properties, his luxury vehicles, and his primary residence to be legally binding the exact second I spoke his name on television. The lawyers nodded in unison and marched down the hallway to execute their orders, their briefcases swinging with purpose. Tasha stayed behind for a moment, looking at my tired clothes. She reached into a garment bag she had brought with her and pulled out a pristine tailored white blazer. She knew I could not go on national television looking like a broken, defeated mother. I slipped off my tear-stained hoodie and put on the blazer, feeling the sharp structure of the shoulders instantly transform my posture. I buttoned it up, smoothing out the fabric as I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the ICU window. The woman staring back at me was no longer the sister who begged for scraps of affection from a mother who despised her. She was not the sister who let her brother steal her future to fund his arrogant delusions. She was Kiara, the sole owner of Aura Health and the architect of their impending destruction. I looked at Tasha and told her to text the CNN producers. We were going to give them the exclusive story of the decade, but it was going to be on my terms. I was going to broadcast live right here from the hospital corridor, so the entire world could see exactly where I was while my family partied across town. Tasha smiled a dangerous, brilliant smile and tapped the confirmation into her phone. The countdown had officially begun, and the golden child had absolutely no idea that his luxurious vow renewal was about to become the most humiliating public execution in Atlanta high society history. Segment 4, The Birth of Aura Health. Tasha turned on her heel and began coordinating with the legal team, while I took a moment to look down at the pristine white fabric of my blazer. The sharp lines and immaculate tailoring felt like a suit of armor protecting my fragile heart from the crushing reality of the hospital ward. I ran my hands over the lapels, feeling the expensive material beneath my fingertips, and I allowed my mind to drift back to the incredibly dark place where this empire was actually born 4 years ago. I did not have custom-tailored suits or a team of ruthless corporate lawyers executing my commands. 4 years ago, I was wearing a threadbare sweater sitting on the stained carpet of a tiny, unheated apartment in the worst part of Atlanta, trying to figure out how I was going to keep my daughter alive. When my mother and Jamal stole my $250,000 inheritance, they did not just take my financial security, they took away my ability to pay for Zuri's initial pediatric cardiology treatments. I was drowning in an endless sea of complex medical bills, collection notices, and insurance denials. Every single day felt like I was suffocating under the weight of a broken healthcare system that was actively trying to crush us. I would spend hours on the phone with hospital billing, departments crying and begging for payment plans, only to be transferred from one indifferent representative to another. I realized very quickly that the entire pediatric billing and donor matching infrastructure was a fragmented, catastrophic mess. It was a chaotic maze designed to confuse and exploit vulnerable families who were already experiencing the worst moments of their entire lives. But they had forgotten one crucial detail about me before they cast me aside. I was a brilliant financial analyst. I had a mind that could see patterns and structural inefficiencies that other people completely missed. I knew exactly how to build the artificial intelligence architecture required to streamline that broken system and connect desperate families with life-saving resources. I started coding Aura Health in the absolute pitch black of night, sitting on a bare mattress on the floor while Zuri slept fitfully beside me. My fingers would go completely numb from the freezing temperatures in our apartment, but I refused to stop typing. I worked grueling 18-hour shifts, pushing my mind and body past every conceivable human limit. I poured every ounce of my rage, my grief, and my desperate maternal love into thousands of lines of complex code. That stolen inheritance was supposed to be my easy way out, but having it ripped away from me forced me to forge a weapon so powerful it would eventually shake the entire medical tech industry to its core. It was not an easy journey by any stretch of the imagination. I took my initial prototype and started pitching to wealthy venture capitalists across the city. I was laughed out of dozens of sleek glass boardrooms. I was a young black single mother with no generational wealth, no prestigious family backing, and a sick child waiting for me at home. The investors looked at me with thinly veiled condescension, dismissing my artificial intelligence platform as a passionate but unrealistic pipe dream. They told me the medical billing industry was too complex for a solo female founder to disrupt. They told me to go back to my day job and leave the tech innovation to the established players. But every single rejection just added more fuel to the roaring fire inside my chest. I refused to take no for an answer. I refined my algorithms. I secured small, independent grants, and I slowly began implementing my software in local community clinics. The results were absolutely undeniable. My platform was saving these clinics millions of dollars in administrative waste and connecting pediatric patients with donor funds faster than any existing legacy system on the market. Within 2 years, Aura Health caught the attention of major national hospital networks. Within 3 years, we were quietly dominating the pediatric health tech sector, expanding our reach across the entire country. While I was surviving on instant ramen and building a billion-dollar unicorn company in absolute secrecy, Jamal was busy loudly burning through my stolen inheritance. He used my money to launch a luxury commercial real estate firm that was entirely built on smoke and mirrors. He bought imported sports cars. He leased a massive corner office in downtown Atlanta. And he married Chloe in a destination wedding in St. Bart's that probably cost more than my entire first year of operating expenses. He loved playing the role of the self-made mogul, posting arrogant videos on social media about his grind and his superior business mindset. He surrounded himself with sycophants and fake friends who praised his brilliance as long as he kept buying the expensive bottles of champagne at the club. He built an entire identity around being the wealthy, successful patriarch of our family, while treating me like a pathetic charity case. But Jamal was a complete fraud. He had absolutely no idea how to actually run a sustainable corporate enterprise. He was reckless, impatient, and incredibly arrogant. He spent millions trying to keep up appearances, while his commercial properties sat empty and mismanaged. For the last 18 months, his company had been secretly hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. He was drowning in overhead costs and failing to secure reliable tenants for his luxury developments. desperate to maintain his lavish lifestyle and keep Chloe draped in designer clothes. He started making catastrophic financial decisions. He took out massive high-interest commercial loans, using his primary residence and his entire property portfolio as collateral. He thought he could outsmart the market, but he was just digging his own grave, deeper and deeper into predatory debt that he had absolutely no chance of ever repaying. The public saw Aura Health as an overnight success, because that was the version that fit inside headlines. The truth was that every line of code had been written beside a hospital bill, every contract negotiated between cardiology appointments, every expansion decision made with the memory of what it felt like to be one denied claim away from losing everything. Tasha understood that history because she had watched the company grow from a fragile prototype into an operation serving hospitals across the country. She also understood why I had insisted that my ownership remain invisible to my family until the moment invisibility stopped being useful. When she returned to the corridor, she carried a thick black dossier and a second tablet. The first page on the tablet showed the transaction that the financial press would announce that night. Aura Health had entered a $1.2 billion mega deal that would put the company in front of a national audience. The second page mattered more to me personally. Aura Holdings. The parent company Jamal had never bothered to investigate, had completed its purchase of the defaulted commercial loans attached to his real estate business. The signatures were final. The debt had changed hands. His lenders were no longer faceless institutions he could stall with promises. They were us. Tasha placed the dossier in my hands. Inside were the loan schedules, collateral documents, default notices, and the clean legal chain showing exactly how much of Jamal's image was financed by obligations he could no longer service. I did not celebrate. Zuri was still fighting for stability 20 yards away. But I understood the symmetry of the moment. 4 years earlier, Jamal had laughed and told me he was building a legacy while I was too poor to save my own child. Now the company I built because of that desperation was strong enough to own the paper beneath his entire empire. Tasha glanced toward the press room where the network crew was beginning to arrive. Once you go on camera, she said, there is no putting this back in the dark. I closed the dossier. Good, I told her. It has been dark long enough. Segment 5, the country club setup. Right at this very moment, my brother was standing in the grand ballroom of an exclusive Atlanta country club hosting a spectacularly expensive vow renewal that he absolutely could not afford. The room was filled with hundreds of the city's most influential socialites, politicians, and wealthy investors. Jamal was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a crystal flute filled with imported vintage champagne, schmoozing the elite crowd with his signature fake smile. Chloe was floating around the room, dripping in diamonds, complaining about the catering and showing off a massive new ring to her jealous friends. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime, projecting an image of untouchable wealth and perfect marital bliss. Jamal had orchestrated this entire lavish event for one specific reason. He was desperately trying to trick new investors into bailing out his sinking company. He had paid a shady public relations contact thousands of dollars to secure a brief promotional shout-out on a major national financial news segment at 10 o'clock tonight. He fully believed that seeing his name broadcast on the network would convince the wealthy attendees to hand over the capital he needed to avoid total bankruptcy. He was so incredibly smug, so blindly confident in his own manipulation. He had no earthly idea that my holding company was the anonymous corporate entity that had been quietly and systematically buying up every single one of his defaulted commercial loans over the past 6 months. We had tracked his financial decline with surgical precision, purchasing his debt for pennies on the dollar. We owned the mortgage on his sprawling mansion. We owned the loans on his luxury vehicles. We owned the liens on every single commercial property in his failing portfolio. We even held the massive line of credit he used to rent the very country club where he was currently celebrating. We had completely surrounded him in the dark, weaving an inescapable financial web while he was distracted by his own vanity. The country club had been designed to make ordinary people feel as if they had stepped into somebody else's inheritance. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble, white flowers climbed the walls in arrangements taller than most of the guests, and a string ensemble played beneath a ceiling, painted to resemble a summer sky. Jamal loved rooms like that, because the room did half his work for him. If the setting looked expensive enough, people assumed the man paying for it must be successful. Yvonne moved through the ballroom as if she owned the building. She stopped at every table long enough to praise Jamal's vision, his discipline, and his instinct for wealth. She never mentioned the inheritance that started his firm. She never mentioned the loans keeping it alive. She certainly never mentioned that her granddaughter was in an operating room across town. When one of her friends asked where I was, Yvonne waved the question away and said I was dealing with one of my usual personal emergencies. Then she immediately redirected the conversation to the new development Jamal was supposedly about to announce. Chloe was even more committed to the performance. She held her left hand slightly higher than necessary so everyone could see the diamond ring Jamal had given her for the vow renewal. The custom gown she had spent the afternoon crying about fit perfectly under the lights. She complained to anyone who would listen about how exhausting it was to coordinate designers, caterers, photographers, and guest security for an event of this scale. She never said my name unless someone asked why Jamal's sister was absent, and when they did, she smiled with polished pity and said family could be complicated. Jamal, meanwhile, worked the investors. He did not waste much time on guests who could not write checks. He moved from banker to developer to private investor, laughing too loudly, and promising that his company was about to enter a new stage of expansion. He hinted at properties he did not fully control, described debt as strategic leverage, and spoke about incoming capital as if it were already committed. The vow renewal was not really a celebration. It was a rescue pitch wrapped in flowers and champagne. At the far end of the ballroom, a massive projector screen had been installed above a small stage. Jamal kept glancing toward it because that screen was the centerpiece of his plan. Through a public relations contact, he had paid for the expectation of a brief mention during a 10 o'clock national financial segment. He had told potential investors that the network exposure would validate his company in front of the entire country. He did not know the network's producers had changed the focus of the segment after Aura Health's deal became the larger story. He did not know my interview had moved from a short founder profile to the center of the broadcast. And he absolutely did not know that Tasha had already sent the network documentation supporting every factual claim I intended to make. Back at Atlanta General, the contrast was almost absurd. There were no chandeliers in the press room. There was a folding table, 2 cameras, cables taped to the floor, and a glass wall through which I could still see the corridor leading toward Zuri's ICU. The producer asked whether I wanted a neutral backdrop. I said no. I wanted the hospital visible. I wanted anyone watching to understand that while Jamal toasted himself under crystal lights, I was speaking from the place where his niece had nearly died without him. Tasha stood beside the camera reviewing the final timing. The legal team checked the last pages of the dossier and confirmed that the public filings associated with the debt transfer were ready to post once the segment began. I asked for one more update from the ICU. Zuri was still stable. Her blood pressure had held. Those were the only numbers in the world that mattered more than what was about to happen on television. Across town, Jamal's confidence kept rising. More guests had arrived. More champagne had been poured. He called Chloe to his side and reminded her to be ready for the cameras. His own event photographer would turn toward them when the network mentioned his company. Yvonne gathered her closest society friends near the front tables so they would have the best view. Jamal wanted witnesses. He wanted applause. He wanted the room to see him publicly confirmed as the golden child he had spent his whole life pretending to be. A message from Tasha's tablet showed that the network was 4 minutes from the segment. Then 3, the camera operator adjusted focus. I buttoned the white blazer and placed the black dossier on the table in front of me. Tasha looked at me one final time. 5 minutes ago, you could still walk away from the family part and just discuss Aura, she said quietly. I shook my head. They made Zuri a burden because they thought nobody would ever hold them accountable. I am not protecting that lie anymore. The producer lifted his hand. 5 minutes to air. Across town, the giant screen above Jamal's ballroom stage brightened from black to the network's financial news feed. Jamal saw it and smiled. Segment 6, the 10 p.m. broadcast. The press room became very quiet as the final commercial break began. Through the glass, I could see nurses moving in the corridor, and farther away the doors that separated me from Zuri. I had spent years imagining a confrontation with my family, but none of those imagined versions had included television lights or a billion-dollar headline. Most of them had been smaller. I had imagined Yvonne admitting what she did. I had imagined Jamal returning the money. I had imagined one sincere apology, sitting there. I understood how much time I had wasted, hoping people who benefited from my silence would voluntarily choose the truth. Tasha placed her hand on the back of my chair for 1 second. It was not a dramatic gesture, it was simply enough to remind me that I was not alone in this room. She whispered that the legal team had confirmed the filings. The network had the supporting documents. The acquisition announcement was cleared. All I had to do was answer the questions exactly the way we had prepared: facts, dates, documents, no exaggeration. I glanced at my phone. No new message from Yvonne. No question from Jamal about Zuri. Nothing from Chloe except the cruelty already sitting in the group chat. That made the decision easier. I turned the phone face down. At the country club, Jamal climbed onto the small stage beneath the projector. He tapped his champagne flute and waited for the room to settle. His voice carried through the speakers, with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the evening belonged to him. He thanked everyone for celebrating his marriage and then told them he had one more surprise. He said they were about to witness the future of the Jamal Carter real estate empire on national television. Several investors raised their glasses. Yvonne beamed. Chloe moved closer to the center aisle so the event photographer could capture her reaction. The network returned from commercial. A familiar anchor appeared on the ballroom screen, and Jamal spread his arms as if he had personally summoned him. For half a second, everything looked exactly the way Jamal expected. Then the lower third graphic changed. In the hospital press room, a producer pointed at me and mouthed, "Stand by." The red tally light on the camera came alive. My monitor showed the same graphic now filling the country club screen: Aura Health acquired in $1.2 billion mega deal. I watched the anchor begin explaining the scale of the transaction, the reach of Aura's pediatric billing platform, and the unusual secrecy surrounding its founder. The story had nothing to do with Jamal's real estate company. I imagined his smile tightening while he waited for the mention he had paid to expect. It never came. The anchor said my name. Across town, the ballroom went silent. Jamal's hand stopped halfway to his glass. Yvonne leaned toward the screen. Chloe frowned as if she had misheard. Then the feed shifted to a split screen, and my face appeared beside the anchor, the sterile hospital corridor unmistakable behind me. I did not smile at my family. I smiled at the anchor because this was not a private argument. It was a business interview, and I intended to remain in control of it. The anchor welcomed me as the founder and chief executive officer of Aura Health. On the other side of Atlanta, Jamal finally understood the part of my life he had never bothered to investigate. His champagne flute slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble floor. No one in the ballroom applauded. The only sound was glass breaking, followed by the anchor saying, "Kiara, congratulations." I want to begin with the question everyone is asking tonight: what made you build this company? I rested one hand on the black dossier and looked directly into the camera. That was the question I had been waiting 4 years to answer. Segment 7, Dropping the Receipts Live. On the broadcast, the veteran anchor smiled warmly and congratulated me on the historic billion-dollar buyout. He leaned forward and asked the question that set the stage for my ultimate revenge. He asked me to share the inspiration behind building such a massive health tech empire from scratch. He asked how a single black mother managed to navigate the ruthless corporate world and create a platform that revolutionized pediatric medical billing and donor matching across the entire country. I looked directly into the camera lens, locking my eyes onto the red recording light. I knew Jamal, Yvonne, and Chloe were staring at my face on that giant projector screen. I knew they were holding their breath, waiting for me to play the role of the quiet, humble sister. They probably thought I would thank my family for their unwavering support, keeping up the fake image they had spent years trying to cultivate. but I was absolutely done protecting their fragile egos. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripped of all emotion, and spoke clearly into the microphone. I told the anchor, and the millions of people watching, that my inspiration did not come from a desire for wealth or prestige. I explained that I was forced to build this company out of absolute desperate necessity. I stated that 4 years ago, my daughter Zuri was diagnosed with a severe pediatric heart condition, and I was suddenly thrust into the nightmare of navigating a broken, fragmented medical system. I told the audience that I needed capital to save my child's life, and I was supposed to have a safety net. I explained that my late grandmother had left a $250,000 life insurance policy, specifically in my name, to ensure my daughter and I would never face poverty. The anchor nodded sympathetically, clearly expecting a story about overcoming natural adversity, but I did not stop there. I reached into the sleek black leather dossier Tasha had handed me and pulled out the original bank transfer documents. I held the papers up directly to the camera, making sure the high-definition lens captured every single detail of the forged authorization form. I stated calmly that I never saw a single penny of my inheritance because my own mother Yvonne forged my signature on these exact legal documents. I explained that she drained my entire safety net while my toddler was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. The anchor's sympathetic smile immediately vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute stunned shock. He tried to interject to ask a clarifying question, but I simply spoke over him, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. I looked straight through the camera lens, speaking directly to the wealthy investors standing in that country club ballroom. I named Jamal's luxury commercial real estate firm, directly making sure every single syllable was perfectly enunciated. I told the world that my mother stole my money and handed it directly to my brother Jamal, so he could fund his arrogant delusions. I stated that he used my stolen inheritance to build a house of cards, masquerading as a successful real estate empire. He bought exotic sports cars and threw lavish parties, while I worked 3 jobs and coded my platform on a bare mattress on the floor. I told the viewers that Jamal's entire company was a complete and utter fraud, drowning in high-interest debt and defaulted loans because he had absolutely no idea how to run a sustainable business. The silence in the television studio was deafening. The CNN producers were frantically whispering in their headsets, completely blindsided by this live public execution, but ratings were ratings, and no one dared to cut the feed. I held up the final stack of legal paperwork showing the official corporate acquisitions from my holding company. I stared into the camera with a cold, calculating smile. I announced that Jamal used stolen funds to build his fragile house of cards, but that exact house of cards had just been acquired by my holding company in a hostile debt buyout this afternoon. I declared that Aura Holdings was the anonymous corporate entity that had spent the last 6 months quietly purchasing every single defaulted commercial loan, mortgage, and credit line associated with his failing real estate firm. I stated that as of 10 o'clock tonight, I was the sole legal proprietor of his entire financial existence. Back at the country club, the atmosphere instantly transformed from shocked silence into pure, unadulterated chaos. The wealthy investors and Atlanta socialites Jamal had spent months trying to impress immediately, began pulling out their phones, frantically checking the financial news feeds to confirm my statements. When they saw the official acquisition filings pop up on their screens, the ballroom erupted into a frenzy of panicked whispers and disgusted glares. They realized in real time that Jamal was not a brilliant mogul. He was a desperate fraud under federal investigation who had stolen from his own sick niece to fund his lifestyle. They immediately began edging toward the exit doors, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a sinking ship that was about to be investigated for massive corporate fraud. The reaction at the country club reached me before the broadcast even ended. On a silent monitor beside the camera, I could see phones rising all over the ballroom as investors searched the public filings. Jamal was no longer looking at the screen with anger. He was looking around the room with fear, because the people he needed most were verifying that I had documents behind every claim. Chloe's scream cut through the ballroom audio captured by one of the event feeds, but the camera moved away before I could see what she did next. At the same moment, my own phone began vibrating against the table. Yvonne's name flashed across the screen again and again. I let it ring. The details of their collapse could wait until the interview was over. In the hospital press room, the CNN anchor was completely speechless, attempting to process the unprecedented live television event that had just unfolded on his broadcast. He stammered, trying to find the right words to close the segment while the producers shouted instructions in his earpiece. I calmly lowered the legal documents back into my black leather folder. I thanked the anchor politely for his time and told him I needed to return to the intensive care unit to be with my daughter. The camera feed finally cut away, returning to the stunned anchor in the studio, and the red broadcasting light above my camera blinked off. I sat back in my chair, letting out a long, slow breath as the heavy weight of the last 4 years finally lifted off my shoulders. Tasha was standing behind the camera crew, clutching her tablet with a brilliant, dangerous smile spreading across her beautiful face. My corporate legal team stood silently by the door, their briefcases ready, their posture radiating absolute victory. I reached into the pocket of my white blazer and pulled out my phone. The screen was lighting up, the bright, glaring interface illuminating the dark corner of the room. The caller identification displayed my mother's name, flashing repeatedly as the phone vibrated violently against my palm. The golden child had fallen. The fake empire was officially liquidated, and the scapegoat was finally holding the matches. I looked at my phone, watching it ring, as the consequences of their cruelty finally arrived right at their doorstep. Segment 8. The Empire Crumbles. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom of the country club lasted for exactly 10 agonizing seconds after the giant projector screen cut to black. The wealthy investors and influential Atlanta socialites stood completely frozen in their designer gowns and custom tuxedos, trying to process the absolute magnitude of the live television broadcast they had just witnessed. My face was no longer glowing on the massive screen, but the devastating truth of my words hung thick and suffocating in the humid air of the lavish event space. Jamal stood motionless in the center of the polished marble dance floor, his expensive imported shoes surrounded by the jagged, sparkling shards of his shattered crystal champagne flute. The smug, arrogant smile he had worn for the entire evening had completely melted off his face, leaving behind a pale mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Slowly at first, and then all at once, the entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The elite guests who had been drinking top-shelf liquor on my stolen dime suddenly snapped out of their shock. They immediately began digging into their expensive clutch purses and tailored suit pockets, pulling out their smartphones. The bright, glowing screens illuminated their horrified faces as they frantically pulled up national financial news feeds and corporate stock market applications. They did not have to search very hard. The breaking news of Aura Health acquiring Jamal's luxury real estate firm in a hostile debt buyout was trending across every single major platform. Digital copies of the foreclosure notices and asset liquidations were already circulating on public business forums, validating every single word I had spoken on national television. Jamal desperately tried to regain control of the catastrophic situation. He bent down, ignoring the broken glass crunching beneath his feet, and grabbed a microphone that had been set up for the evening toasts. His hands were shaking so violently that the microphone produced a loud, piercing shriek of feedback, causing several guests to cover their ears. He stammered into the microphone, his voice cracking and pitching wildly as he begged everyone to calm down. He tried to tell the crowd that it was all a massive misunderstanding, a temporary clerical error that his corporate lawyers would sort out by Monday morning. He promised them that his company was still highly profitable and begged the investors not to pull their funding. But nobody was listening to his pathetic lies anymore. The flop sweat was pouring down his forehead, completely ruining his perfectly groomed appearance and soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. The wealthy investors, who had been seriously considering handing him millions of dollars just 20 minutes ago, were now looking at him like he was carrying a highly contagious disease. They recognized a sinking ship when they saw one, and nobody in that room was willing to go down with a fraud who was actively under federal investigation for stealing from his own sick niece. The mass exodus began. Immediately, powerful local politicians and wealthy real estate developers grabbed their partners by the arm and headed straight for the heavy mahogany exit doors. They did not even bother to say goodbye to the groom. They just marched past him, muttering insults and expressing their absolute disgust at the entire fake production. Jamal actually lunged forward, trying to physically block a prominent bank executive from leaving. But the man simply shoved Jamal aside, telling him to get his fraudulent hands off his suit. Across the rapidly emptying ballroom, Yvonne was experiencing her own deeply personal version of absolute hell. My mother had spent her entire adult life desperately clawing her way up the social ladder. She had used the $250,000 she stole from my grandmother's life insurance policy to buy her way into these exclusive Atlanta circles. She was currently wearing a custom silk gown, dripping in expensive pearls, holding a designer handbag that cost more than my rent used to be. She had invited all the most prominent women from her high society clubs, wanting to show off her golden child's incredible wealth. And now those exact same women were standing in a tight circle, whispering viciously while staring directly at her. Yvonne tried to put on her signature fake smile, forcing her trembling legs to walk toward the group of elite matriarchs. She reached out to touch the arm of the club president, hoping to smooth things over with a manufactured excuse about family drama. But the woman violently snatched her arm away, stepping back as if my mother was physically repulsive. The woman looked Yvonne up and down with an expression of pure, withering contempt. She loudly announced that stealing from a sick child to fund a fake luxury lifestyle was the most despicable ghetto behavior she had ever witnessed in her entire life. She told Yvonne that her membership to their exclusive society was permanently revoked and that she would make sure every country club in Atlanta knew exactly what kind of monster she truly was. The brutal public rejection hit my mother so hard, her knees literally buckled beneath her. She collapsed against a high-top cocktail table, her manicured hands clutching her chest as a massive panic attack seized her entire body. She could not breathe. The walls of the lavish ballroom felt like they were rapidly closing in on her, crushing the fake identity she had spent years building. The women she admired so much turned their backs on her and walked out of the venue, leaving Yvonne gasping for air. Alone in the corner of a room she could no longer afford to be in. But the most spectacular destruction of the evening belonged to Chloe, the white woman who had eagerly married into my family, purely for the money. The status and the luxurious lifestyle was currently standing frozen near the massive floral archway. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was slightly messy, and her face was flushed bright red as the devastating reality of corporate debt laws crashed heavily into her privileged brain. She was not just losing her rich husband, she was legally tied to his massive, catastrophic debt. She vividly remembered signing dozens of joint tax returns and corporate loan guarantees over the past 18 months, because Jamal had assured her it was just standard administrative paperwork to protect their assets. Chloe suddenly realized that her entire designer lifestyle was officially over. She realized that she was equally liable for the millions of dollars in predatory loans that were now entirely owned by the sister-in-law she had viciously insulted via text message just a few hours ago. She realized that the anonymous corporate entity holding the immediate eviction notices for her sprawling suburban mansion and her imported luxury vehicles was me, the very woman she had told to stop bothering them and handle it herself. The sheer magnitude of her impending poverty snapped whatever fragile composure she had left. Chloe marched right into the center of the dance floor, her expensive high heels clicking sharply against the marble. She did not care who was still watching. She unleashed a blood-curdling hysterical scream directly into Jamal's face. She called him a pathetic, broke liar, a manipulative fraud, and a completely useless failure. She screamed that he had ruined her entire life and tricked her into signing her financial future away to a company owned by his genius sister Jamal, tried to shush her, trying to grab her hands to calm her down. But Chloe violently slapped his hands away. She reached down and grabbed the massive diamond ring off her left hand, the ring he had definitely bought using my stolen inheritance. She threw the heavy diamond violently at his face, the sharp metal striking him right below his eye before bouncing off his chest and skittering away into the shadows under a catering table. Chloe hiked up the skirt of her heavy custom gown and stormed out of the ballroom sobbing, hysterically and cursing his name, leaving her husband completely emasculated and utterly alone. The grand ballroom was now practically empty, save for the bewildered catering staff and the venue management. The country club manager, A stern-looking man flanked by two large security guards marched directly up to where Jamal was standing, looking completely shell-shocked. The manager informed Jamal that in light of the breaking financial news, the country club was voiding their event contract. Effective immediately, he demanded that Jamal provide a valid credit card to cover the remaining balance of the $150,000 party, or the security team would physically detain him until the local authorities arrived to press charges for theft of services. Jamal frantically patted his pockets, knowing full well that every single corporate card he owned was already frozen by my legal team. He realized he had absolutely no money, no power, and no way out of the spectacular mess he had created. His eyes went completely wild, scanning the empty room like a cornered animal, desperate to escape the consequences of his own monumental arrogance. He saw Yvonne still leaning heavily against the cocktail table, trying to catch her breath. He ignored the venue manager. Completely shoving past the security guards with a sudden burst of frantic adrenaline, he sprinted across the room and grabbed his mother aggressively by the upper arm, hauling her away from the table. I did not bother using the grand main entrance. He dragged Yvonne, stumbling and crying, through the swinging doors of the service kitchen, ignoring the shouts of the catering staff. They burst out into the humid night air of the back loading dock, sprinting toward his leased luxury sports car, parked in the VIP section. Jamal shoved his mother into the passenger seat and threw himself behind the steering wheel. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely press the ignition button. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot down hard on the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the asphalt, leaving thick black marks as he tore out of the country club parking lot, moving at a dangerously reckless speed. He was completely unhinged, furious, and absolutely desperate. He gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, steering the speeding car directly into the downtown traffic. He was not running away to hide. He was heading straight toward Atlanta, General Hospital. He was coming for me. Segment 9. The Lobby Confrontation. Jamal drove his leased luxury sports car like an absolute madman through the neon-lit streets of downtown Atlanta, swerving recklessly between lanes and running through multiple red lights. He was completely unhinged, gripped by a blinding panic that completely overrode any sense of rational thought. The expensive engine roared as he slammed his foot down on the gas pedal, desperate to reach Atlanta General Hospital. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were completely white while Yvonne sat in the passenger seat beside him, sobbing hysterically and clutching her chest. She was still wearing her custom silk gown, but the elegant fabric was now wrinkled and soaked with the nervous sweat of a woman who had just watched her entire high society reputation disintegrate on live television. The smell of burnt rubber filled the humid night air as Jamal slammed on the brakes, skidding into the emergency drop-off zone right outside the main hospital entrance. He did not even bother to put the expensive car in park or turn off the engine. He just threw the door open and sprinted frantically toward the sliding glass doors, leaving his mother to stumble blindly out of the passenger seat and chase after him. The scene inside the hospital lobby was immediately chaotic. Jamal burst through the automatic doors looking like a completely deranged lunatic. His custom-tailored tuxedo was drenched in sweat, the expensive fabric clinging to his back and shoulders. There was a highly visible red scratch right below his eye where Chloe had violently thrown her massive diamond engagement ring at his face. Just 20 minutes earlier, he marched straight up to the main reception desk, slamming his hands down hard on the counter and screaming at the terrified triage nurses. He demanded to know exactly what room his sister Kiara was in, screaming that he was a powerful real estate mogul and that they needed to call her down to the lobby. Right this second, Yvonne stumbled through the doors a moment later, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick black streaks, completely ruining her expensive makeup. She joined Jamal at the desk, wailing loudly about how her daughter was trying to destroy their family and demanding that the hospital administration intervene. Upstairs in the quiet, sterile sanctuary of the pediatric intensive care unit, I was sitting peacefully beside my daughter's bed, watching her small chest rise and fall in a steady, comforting rhythm. The chaotic storm that was currently raging down in the main lobby felt like it belonged to an entirely different universe. My phone vibrated softly in the pocket of my pristine white blazer. I pulled it out and saw a secure message from Tasha. Our corporate security team, had just intercepted a distress call from the hospital front desk, alerting them that an erratic, aggressive man, matching my brother's description, was currently terrorizing the reception staff downstairs. Tasha looked up from her own tablet, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, protective intensity. She did not have to say a single word. We both knew exactly what was happening. The consequences of their spectacular public downfall had finally arrived at our doorstep. 4 years ago, if Jamal had shown up at a hospital screaming my name, I would have been absolutely terrified. I would have shrunk back into the shadows, desperately trying to apologize and appease him to keep the peace. But the scared, desperate sister, who used to beg for their love, was completely gone. I looked down at Zuri, gently brushing a soft, natural curl away from her sleeping face. She was safe, she was recovering, and she would never ever have to witness her mother being bullied by these toxic people ever again. I stood up slowly, smoothing out the sharp lines of my tailored CEO blazer. I turned to Tasha and gave her a single definitive nod. It was time to finally face the monsters who had kept me in the dark for so long. But this time, I was not going to run, and I was certainly not going to hide. I stepped out of the intensive care unit and walked toward the private glass elevator at the end of the corridor. Tasha matched my stride, walking perfectly in sync on my right side. Her posture radiating absolute corporate authority. Behind us marched two of the most ruthless, highly paid corporate attorneys in the entire state of Georgia, carrying heavy leather briefcases containing the financial execution of Jamal's entire life. As we approached the elevator bay, the head of hospital security was waiting for us, flanked by three large, imposing security guards. They had been briefed on the situation and were completely prepared to protect their high-profile billionaire patient from the unhinged man causing a disturbance in their lobby. The glass elevator doors slid open with a soft digital chime, and our entire entourage stepped inside. The descent down to the main floor took exactly 45 seconds, but it felt like a magnificent victory lap. I looked through the transparent glass walls of the elevator, watching the sprawling lobby come into view below us. I could see Jamal pacing furiously back and forth near the reception desk, running his trembling hands through his hair, while Yvonne leaned heavily against a concrete pillar, looking completely pathetic and entirely stripped of her usual arrogant pride. When the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors glided open, the heavy, authoritative footsteps of my security team, echoing on the polished marble floor, caused the entire lobby to go completely dead silent. Jamal and Yvonne whipped their heads around, their eyes locking onto the formidable wall of corporate power, stepping out of the elevator. Jamal's bloodshot eyes went wide as he took in the scene. He was expecting to find the weak, struggling single mother he had always mocked. Instead, he found a billionaire executive flanked by elite security and expensive lawyers, but his massive ego simply could not accept his new reality. He tried to fall back on his usual intimidation tactics, marching aggressively toward me with his finger pointed directly at my face. He opened his mouth to scream, but before he could even get within 10 feet of me, the four hospital security guards instantly stepped forward, forming an impenetrable human barricade between us. Jamal stopped dead in his tracks, his chest heaving as he realized he could not physically intimidate me anymore. He resorted to shouting over the shoulders of the security guards, his voice cracking with pure desperate panic. He demanded that I pull my phone out right this second and call the CNN anchor back. He ordered me to tell the national news networks that the entire broadcast was just a massive prank, a stupid misunderstanding between siblings. He screamed that investors were pulling out of his company left and right, and that I needed to wire him $10 million immediately from my holding company to save his commercial properties from total foreclosure. He was absolutely delusional, still trying to give me orders while his entire life was actively burning to the ground. Yvonne pushed her way past him, trying a completely different tactic. She ignored the security guards and tried to play the role of the devastated, loving mother. She clasped her hands together, tears streaming down her ruined face, crying out to me in a loud, dramatic wail. She begged me to think about what I was doing to my own blood, she cried. about how all her elite country club friends had turned their backs on her, and how her entire high society reputation was completely destroyed. She asked me how I could possibly be so incredibly cruel and vindictive to my own family in front of the entire world. She stood there crying about her lost status, without ever once asking if her 7-year-old granddaughter had survived her open-heart surgery. I stood perfectly still behind the wall of security guards, my expression entirely blank and devoid of any emotion. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or cry or try to defend myself against their pathetic accusations. The profound contrast between my absolute ice-cold calm and their frantic, sweaty desperation was the most powerful statement I could ever make. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and spoke with a quiet, undeniable authority that made the entire lobby hold its breath. I reminded her that less than 6 hours ago she sent a text message to our family group chat complaining that my dying child was ruining her special day. I reminded her that she explicitly told me to stop making Zuri her problem. I looked at Jamal taking in his ruined tuxedo and his terrified expression. I reminded him that while I was standing completely alone in a freezing hallway, begging for my family to support me, he told me he was too busy and ordered me to handle it myself. Jamal opened his mouth to argue, to make another pathetic excuse about how stressed he was about his vow renewal. But the words died in his throat. I did not give him the chance to speak another syllable. I turned slightly to my right and held my hand out. Tasha unzipped her heavy leather briefcase with a smooth, practiced motion and pulled out a sleek black corporate folder. She placed it firmly into my outstretched hand. The folder contained the immediate legal foreclosure notices for every single commercial property Jamal falsely claimed to own, along with the eviction papers for his primary luxury residence and the repossession orders for his imported vehicles. I stepped forward, the security guards parting just enough to let me through. I held the sleek black folder out toward my brother. He stared at it like it was a venomous snake, his hands trembling violently as he slowly reached out to take it from my grasp. His arrogant facade had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic broken fraud who had finally run out of other people's money to steal. He looked down at the folder and then back up at my face, his eyes silently begging for a mercy he had never once shown me or my daughter. I did not blink. I did not smile. I simply looked him dead in the eyes and delivered the final, absolute truth that would echo in his mind for the rest of his miserable life. "You told me to handle it," I said, quoting the exact text message he had sent me earlier that afternoon. I handled it. Segment 10, the foreclosure. Jamal stood completely frozen in the middle of the bright hospital lobby, his shaking fingers clutching the edges of the sleek black corporate folder I had just handed him. He looked down at the matte leather cover as if it were a ticking bomb, waiting to detonate right in his hands. His breathing was ragged and shallow, his chest heaving under his sweat-soaked tuxedo shirt. Slowly, and with extreme hesitation, he flipped the cover open, his bloodshot eyes scanning the crisp white legal documents. Stacked neatly inside the very first page was a brilliantly detailed summary of his absolute financial ruin, meticulously prepared by my elite corporate attorneys. He stared at the bold black text that officially declared Aura Holdings as the sole proprietor of his entire commercial real estate portfolio. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land, as he read the immediate foreclosure notices for every single property he had ever bragged about owning: the glass front office buildings, downtown, the luxury retail spaces he had leveraged to the absolute limit, and the undeveloped commercial lots he had used to secure massive predatory loans were all officially gone, legally repossessed by the sister he had mercilessly mocked just a few hours ago. He frantically flipped to the second page, his trembling fingers tearing the edge of the thick paper, hoping against hope that there was some kind of mistake, but the reality only grew much worse. The next document was a legally binding repossession order for his entire fleet of imported luxury vehicles, the expensive sports cars he loved to show off on social media, to impress his fake friends and maintain his fraudulent image, were currently being loaded onto flatbed tow trucks by my repossession agents right outside the country club parking lot. But the final document in the stack was the one that completely broke him. It was the immediate eviction notice for his sprawling multi-million-dollar suburban mansion, the very same house where he and Chloe had hosted lavish dinners using my stolen inheritance. He stared at the red legal seal at the bottom of the page, confirming that the bank had transferred the deed directly to my holding company. His arrogant, untouchable facade completely shattered right there in the hospital lobby. He dropped the folder, letting the papers scatter across the polished marble floor, and fell heavily to his knees, weeping uncontrollably. He grabbed the hem of my white blazer, begging me to stop the foreclosures, pleading with me to let him keep his house, because he had absolutely nowhere else to go, and his entire life was over. Yvonne could not bear to see her precious golden child humiliated on his knees begging for mercy in front of the entire hospital security staff and my intimidating corporate legal team. She rushed forward, shoving past the remaining space between the guards, and threw her arms around Jamal's, shaking shoulders. She pulled him against her ruined custom silk gown, glaring up at me with an expression of pure, vicious hatred. She completely ignored the fact that her son had stolen my future and built his life on a foundation of massive predatory debt. Instead, she immediately resorted to playing the perpetual victim, twisting the narrative to make me look like a heartless monster. "You are destroying this family," she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing harshly off the high lobby ceilings, causing passing nurses and doctors to stop and stare. "How can you possibly do this to your own brother, your own blood? You are a vindictive, hateful girl who is just jealous of his incredible success. You are evicting us from our homes and leaving us with absolutely nothing. You are tearing this family apart over a stupid grudge, and I will never ever forgive you for doing this to my son." I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness, where my love and respect for her used to reside. She was still fiercely protecting the son who had driven their family into total bankruptcy, while continuing to gaslight and abuse the daughter who had literally built a billion-dollar empire from scratch while sitting on a mattress on the floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not apologize. I simply looked at Tasha, who was standing patiently by my side, holding the second black leather folder we had prepared specifically for this exact moment. Tasha handed it to me, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, unapologetic pride. I stepped back from my mother, ensuring there was enough distance between us so she could not try to physically grab my clothes again. I held the second folder out toward her, telling her that she was entirely wrong about me, destroying the family. I told her that she was the one who burned our family to the ground. The very second she decided my survival and my daughter's life were worth sacrificing for Jamal's arrogant delusions. Yvonne slowly reached up and took the folder from my hands, her eyes darting nervously between my ice-cold expression and the intimidating presence of my corporate lawyers standing silently right behind me. She opened the cover and looked down at the documents inside. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and incredibly old. The papers she was holding were not eviction notices or commercial foreclosures. They were much worse. They were fully drafted criminal fraud charges, meticulously prepared by my legal team, outlining the exact details of how she had stolen the $250,000 life insurance policy my grandmother had left for me. The documents included high-resolution copies of the bank transfers she had illegally authorized and the forged signature she had used to drain the account. There was also a sworn affidavit from a top-tier handwriting expert confirming that the signature on the release forms belonged to her and not to me, along with the formal legal complaint that was ready to be filed with the federal prosecutor's office for massive wire fraud and financial theft. My mother stared at the drafted criminal charges, her hands shaking so violently that the papers rattled loudly in the quiet lobby. She realized in a matter of seconds that she was not just facing public humiliation or a loss of her prestigious high society status. She was facing actual serious prison time for committing federal financial fraud against her own child. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a brand new kind of unadulterated terror. She tried to speak, trying to form a coherent sentence, to explain away the theft, to say she was just borrowing the money to help the family, or that she meant to pay it back. Eventually, when Jamal's business took off, but the pathetic lies completely dried up in her throat. She knew that the elite corporate lawyers standing directly behind me would absolutely decimate any pathetic defense she tried to mount. In a court of law, she realized that the poor, struggling single mother she had mocked and belittled for years was now holding the ultimate power to strip away her freedom and send her to a federal penitentiary. She opened her mouth to beg for mercy, begging me to remember that she was my mother, but I cut her off before she could utter a single manipulative word. I looked down at both of them and told them the practical part was simple. They had 48 hours to vacate every property covered by the foreclosure and repossession orders. Jamal would surrender the vehicles and access credentials connected to the company. Yvonne would leave the condo whose mortgage had also ended up inside the debt portfolio. Their personal belongings were theirs, the collateral was not. Then I made one point especially clear to my mother. The fraud evidence was no longer a private bargaining chip. My attorneys had preserved the original bank records, the forged authorization, the handwriting analysis, and the chain of transfers. Copies were being provided to the appropriate authorities, and I would neither hide evidence nor interfere with whatever charging decision followed. She had spent years assuming family loyalty meant I was required to protect her from consequences. I told her that assumption was over. She could cooperate, retain counsel, and tell the truth, but she could not threaten me into making the record disappear. I turned back to Jamal. 48 hours, I repeated. After that, the locks change. Jamal and Yvonne sat on the floor completely paralyzed by the absolute finality of my words. They had no leverage, no power, and no money left to fight me. They had been completely and totally defeated by the very person they had spent their entire lives trying to keep down. They realized that their entire fake empire was completely liquidated, and they were now essentially homeless, relying entirely on my highly conditional mercy just to stay out of federal prison. I turned to the head of hospital security who had been watching the entire exchange. In stunned, absolute silence, I politely asked him to escort these two individuals out of the building and to ensure they were permanently banned from ever stepping foot on the hospital premises. Again, the security guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing Jamal by the arms and hauling his dead weight up from the polished marble floor. They grabbed Yvonne by the elbows, pulling her up and forcing her to walk toward the sliding glass doors. Jamal did not fight back or try to argue. He just hung his head in absolute crushing defeat, his ruined tuxedo dripping with sweat and his entire body shaking with the realization that his life was completely over. Yvonne sobbed hysterically, looking back over her shoulder and pleading with me to reconsider, begging me to remember that we were blood and that she loved me. But I simply turned my back on them, walking away toward the private glass elevator with Tasha and my elite legal team right beside me, leaving them to be physically thrown out into the hot, humid Atlanta night with absolutely nothing to their names, except the clothes on their backs. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt as the elevator doors slid shut, blocking out the sound of my mother's frantic wailing. I had finally completely severed the toxic anchor that had been dragging me down my entire life, and I was ready to return to the pediatric intensive care unit, to be with the only family that actually mattered. Segment 11. Chloe's Betrayal. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive suite on the 40th floor of the Aura Holdings corporate tower, illuminating the sleek minimalist furniture and the massive mahogany desk where I sat perfectly composed. I had not slept a single minute since the explosive confrontation in the hospital lobby, but the adrenaline of absolute victory running through my veins completely overpowered any physical exhaustion. My elite legal team had spent the entire night executing the final foreclosure filings and legally locking down every single asset that used to belong to my brother. The city of Atlanta was waking up to a brand new reality, where Jamal's fake luxury real estate empire was nothing more than dust blowing in the wind, and I was the one holding the broom. I was drinking a cup of bitter black coffee, reviewing the morning financial reports, when the heavy glass doors of my office swung open. Tasha walked in, looking deeply amused. Her natural hair, perfectly styled in a sharp crown, followed closely by two of our massive building security guards trailing right behind them, was Chloe looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant, glamorous socialite who had texted me to handle my own dying child just yesterday afternoon. Her expensive blonde hair was tangled and unwashed. Her face was completely bare of makeup, revealing the dark swollen bags under her eyes from crying all night. She was wearing a baggy designer tracksuit that looked like she had slept in it. Her hands were shaking violently as she clutched a massive, expensive handbag to her chest, staring around my vast executive office with wide, terrified eyes. She had always looked down on me, treating me like a ghetto charity case who was beneath her notice, but standing here in the undeniable center of my billion-dollar corporate headquarters. The crushing weight of her own insignificance finally seemed to register in her highly privileged brain. Chloe practically ran toward my desk, shoving past the security guards and dropping heavily into one of the expensive leather guest chairs. She burst into loud, dramatic tears, immediately trying to play the role of the innocent, helpless victim trapped in a nightmare she did not create. She leaned forward, putting her shaking hands on my desk, and begged me to call off the eviction notices. She completely threw Jamal under the bus. Without a single second of hesitation, she sobbed hysterically, claiming that he was a manipulative monster who lied to her about everything. She swore up and down that she had absolutely no idea that he had stolen my $250,000 inheritance from my grandmother to fund his business. She claimed she thought he was a self-made genius and that she never would have married him if she knew he was a thief, stealing from a sick little black girl. She went on, spinning a pathetic narrative about how she was just a naive woman who trusted the wrong man and how she was completely blinded by his arrogant charisma. She pleaded with me, woman to woman, begging me not to take her sprawling suburban mansion and her imported luxury cars. She cried about how she would be completely ruined in Atlanta high society and how she had nowhere else to go. She tried to tell me that she was just as much a victim of Jamal's narcissistic lies as I was, and that we should team up against him. She actually had the absolute audacity to reach across the mahogany wood and try to hold my hand, asking me to show her some grace and let her keep the primary residence and the joint bank accounts, because she did not deserve to be punished for her husband's financial crimes. She promised me that she would personally testify against him in court if I just let her walk away with her precious status. Intact, I sat perfectly still, watching her perform this pathetic, desperate monologue. I did not pull my hand away. I just stared at her with eyes so incredibly cold they could have frozen a raging river. I let her cry and beg and humiliate herself for 10 solid minutes before I finally decided to speak. I leaned back in my ergonomic executive chair, steepling my fingers together, and asked Chloe if she really expected me to believe that she was just an innocent, ignorant bystander. Chloe nodded vigorously, wiping her fake tears and swearing on her life that she knew absolutely nothing about the missing money or the fraudulent loans. I turned to Tasha, who was leaning against the doorframe with a dangerously sharp smile. I gave her a single nod. Tasha walked over to the integrated sound system control panel on the wall and pressed a button. A clear, crisp audio recording instantly began playing through the hidden surround sound speakers installed in the ceiling of my office. Chloe's own unmistakable voice echoed loudly through the room, completely shattering her pathetic victim narrative in a matter of seconds. The recording was from exactly 4 months ago, when Tasha had gone undercover, posing as a wealthy private wealth consultant at an exclusive Buckhead Day spa that Chloe frequented in the audio. Chloe was laughing arrogantly, loudly bragging to Tasha about how incredibly smart she and Jamal were. She boasted on the recording about how they had cleverly siphoned millions of dollars from the failing real estate firm and funneled the cash into offshore shell companies under her maiden name to hide the money from their commercial creditors and the Internal Revenue Service. Chloe was caught on tape explicitly laughing about the money Jamal took from his pathetic sister, saying it was the best seed capital they ever stole because I was too stupid and broke to ever hire a lawyer to fight them for it. She gleefully detailed exactly how she had personally forged several corporate loan guarantees to keep their luxury lifestyle afloat, while the business was secretly burning to the ground. The color instantly vanished from Chloe's face, turning her a sickly shade of chalk white as her own arrogant words condemned her. She stopped crying immediately, her mouth hanging open in absolute pure terror. She realized she was not just caught in a lie. She was caught confessing to massive federal financial crimes on a crystal-clear audio recording. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk, and looked directly into her panicked eyes. I told her that the federal authorities already had that exact Audio file safely secured in their evidence database. I explained that my corporate lawyers had submitted the recording, the offshore bank statements, and the forged loan documents to the federal prosecutor's office at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. I told her that she was not a victim. She was an active, willing participant in a massive criminal conspiracy, and she was going to face federal wire fraud and money laundering charges, right alongside the husband she had just tried to sell out. Chloe began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as the reality of federal prison set in. She tried to speak, trying to backtrack and claim the audio was out of context, or that she was just making things up to sound important at the spa. But I raised my hand, demanding absolute silence. I reminded her of the text message she had sent me yesterday when I was standing alone in the pediatric intensive care unit, begging for my family to show up. I reminded her that she complained about my dying child, ruining her champagne toast, and ordered me to stop bothering them and handle it myself. I looked at her shaking, terrified form and told her that I was handling it exactly like she asked. I informed her that the eviction notice on her mansion was effective immediately, and if she was not off the property in exactly 2 hours, my private security team would physically throw her designer clothes out onto the street. I looked at the security guards standing by the door and told them to escort this federal criminal out of my corporate building and to ensure she never stepped foot on the premises again. Chloe did not fight back. She was completely destroyed, her entire world, her money, her status, her freedom, all stripped away in a matter of minutes. The security guards grabbed her by the arms and hauled her out of the office, her hysterical sobbing echoing down the long corporate hallway, until the heavy glass doors finally clicked shut, blocking out the pathetic sound of her ruin. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly start to drain from my body, leaving behind a quiet, profound sense of closure. The fake empire was completely dead, and every single person who had contributed to my misery was now facing the brutal, unyielding consequences of their own actions. I turned back to my computer screen, ready to finalize the liquidation transfers. But I stopped when I heard a sharp, sudden gasp from the doorway. Tasha was standing near the entrance, holding her mobile phone tightly against her ear. Her dark eyes were wide and shining with an incredible, unspeakable emotion. She slowly lowered the phone from her face, looking at me with the most massive, radiant smile I had ever seen in my entire life. The heavy, tense corporate atmosphere in the room completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming rush of pure electric hope. Tasha took a step toward my desk, her voice trembling with absolute joy as she spoke the only words that actually mattered to me in the entire universe. She looked at me and said, "The hospital just called. Kiara Zuri is awake." Segment 12. The Awakening. The heavy glass doors of my corporate office closed behind Chloe, shutting out her pathetic sobbing for good, but I barely registered the sound because my entire universe had just violently shifted on its axis when Tasha spoke those magical words. Zuri is awake. The cold, ruthless corporate armor that I had worn for the last 24 hours instantly evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the raw, desperate beating heart of a mother who had been holding her breath since yesterday afternoon. I did not even bother grabbing my designer handbag or shutting down my computer terminal. I just broke into a dead sprint, running past my bewildered security team and sprinting down the long hallway toward the private executive elevator. Tasha was right beside me, matching my frantic pace, her dark eyes shining with tears of absolute joy. We bypassed the parking garage entirely and jumped straight into the back of my waiting corporate town car. I told my driver to break every single speed limit in the city of Atlanta to get us back to the pediatric intensive care unit as fast as physically possible. The ride to the hospital felt like it took an absolute eternity. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to clasp them tightly together in my lap. I watched the city buildings blur past the tinted windows, my mind racing back to the terrifying moment the surgical nurses had rushed Zuri into the operating room, the entire corporate war, the hostile takeovers, the public destruction of my toxic family. All of it felt completely insignificant compared to the singular, profound need to see my daughter's beautiful brown eyes open again when the town car finally screeched to a halt outside the main hospital entrance. I did not wait for the driver to open my door. I shoved it open myself and sprinted through the automatic sliding glass doors, my expensive white blazer flying open behind me. I completely ignored the reception desk and ran straight for the secure elevators, slamming my palm against the up button over and over again until the doors finally parted. I ran down the sterile white corridor of the pediatric cardiology wing, my heels echoing loudly against the polished linoleum floor as I rounded the final corner. I saw Dr. Sterling standing outside Zuri's room, holding a medical chart. He looked up, and a massive, genuine smile spread across his exhausted face, the deep lines of worry around his eyes completely gone. He nodded his head at me and stepped aside, holding the heavy glass door open. I walked into the room, my breath catching painfully in my throat. The erratic, terrifying beeping of the heart monitors from yesterday had been replaced by a slow, steady, rhythmic tone that sounded like the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. Zuri was lying in the center of the large hospital bed, looking incredibly small, but the frightening pale gray color of her skin was gone, replaced by a warm, healthy glow. She slowly turned her head toward the door as I walked in, and her beautiful brown eyes fluttered open. They were heavy with medication and exhaustion, but they were bright and clear and absolutely perfect. She looked at me, and the corners of her mouth turned up into a weak but undeniable smile. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice raspy and soft. I collapsed onto the edge of her mattress, wrapping my arms around her tiny body with tremendous care. Avoiding the medical tubing across her chest, I buried my face in her soft, natural curls, inhaling the scent of her skin and letting out a deep, guttural sob of pure, unadulterated relief. The heavy, crushing weight of the last 4 years, the fear, the poverty, the loneliness, all of it finally shattered into a million pieces and washed away in a flood of grateful tears. Dr. Sterling placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, telling me that her heart was functioning perfectly on its own, and that the surgery was an absolute complete success for the first time since my family stole my inheritance. I finally took a full, deep breath of air. I sat there for hours, just holding her small hand in mine, watching her drift peacefully in and out of a healing sleep. Tasha pulled up a chair on the other side of the bed, silently standing guard over us, like a fiercely protective aunt. The sterile hospital room suddenly felt like the safest, most beautiful sanctuary in the entire world. But the profound peace of that moment was briefly interrupted when my mobile phone began to vibrate violently inside my blazer pocket. I carefully pulled my hand away from Zuri's and pulled the phone out, looking at the bright glowing screen. The caller identification simply said, "Unknown number." A cold instinct washed over me, telling me exactly who was on the other end of the line. I stood up and walked silently out into the hallway, gently pulling the glass door shut behind me, before answering the call and holding the phone up to my ear. A ragged breath came through the speaker. "Kiara, don't hang up." It was Jamal. For a moment I said nothing. Behind the glass door I could see Zuri sleeping with Tasha beside her. That image kept me calm. Jamal rushed to fill the silence. He said everything had gotten out of control. He blamed Chloe for abandoning him, blamed Yvonne for mishandling the inheritance, blamed his lenders for tightening terms, blamed investors for panicking, and somehow even blamed the television segment for making an ordinary business downturn look criminal. The only person he did not blame was himself. Then he asked for money. Not an apology, not an update on Zuri. Money. He said $10 million would give him enough liquidity to stop the worst foreclosures and buy time to restructure. When I did not answer, the number dropped to 5 million. Then 2. He promised he would sign anything I wanted. He said we were family, and that family was supposed to save each other when things got bad. I almost laughed at the cruelty of that sentence. Instead, I asked one question. "Do you know whether Zuri is awake?" Silence. He had called the hospital. He had called me from an unknown number because his own number was blocked. He had found time to beg for millions of dollars. But he had not even asked whether his niece survived. "That is your answer," I said. He started talking faster, but I stopped listening. I told him the debt process would continue through the lawyers, the fraud evidence would continue through the authorities, and there would be no personal loan, no private rescue, and no secret deal. Then I said the words I should have learned years earlier: do not contact me again. I ended the call and blocked the number. When I stepped back into Zuri's room, she was awake again. Her eyes followed me as I returned to the chair. "Was that Uncle Jamal?" she whispered. I did not burden her with the truth. I squeezed her hand and told her it was just business, and that she did not need to worry about it. She was 7 years old. She had already carried enough of the adults around her. Dr. Sterling came in later that afternoon with another set of results. Zuri's heart function remained strong. The complication had not changed the outcome of the surgery. If the next 24 hours stayed uneventful, she would leave intensive care and begin the slower work of recovery. I sat beside her until the room darkened, and the city lights came on beyond the hospital windows. For the first time in 4 years, I was not building a plan against my family, preparing evidence chasing a payment, or wondering whether I could survive the next medical bill. The company was secure. The truth was public. The people who hurt us were finally responsible for their own choices. My only job in that room was to be Zuri's mother, and for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. Segment 13, The New Standard. 1 month later. Atlanta had stopped treating Jamal's collapse like breaking news and started treating it like a cautionary tale. The giant headlines disappeared, but the consequences became more concrete every day. His commercial properties moved through foreclosure and liquidation. Vehicles that once filled his social media pages were sold. Office furniture, development equipment, and other business assets were cataloged and auctioned under the supervision of the companies and creditors now entitled to them. The mansion he had used as proof of his success was no longer his. The image had vanished first. The property followed. I did not attend the auctions. I did not need to watch strangers bid on the symbols Jamal had used to humiliate me. Tasha sent me the reports because the numbers mattered to Aura Holdings, not because I needed entertainment from his loss. Every time an asset converted to cash, the proceeds moved through the legal waterfall set by the debt documents. Some went to costs, some to senior obligations, and some returned to the portfolio we had acquired. The process was less dramatic than the country club collapse, but in a way it was more final. Champagne glasses could be replaced. Legal ownership could not be argued away with a speech. Jamal tried for several days to keep his public persona alive. He posted vague messages about betrayal and temporary restructuring. Then the posts stopped. Investors would not return his calls. Former partners distanced themselves. The same people who used to repeat his opinions about discipline and success now described him as reckless. I heard through counsel that he had moved into a small rental and was trying to sell whatever personal items remained outside the collateral. I felt no triumph at that detail. I only noticed how ordinary the truth looked once the performance was gone. He was not a king who had been unfairly dethroned. He was a man who had spent more than he earned, borrowed against everything he owned, and treated stolen money as proof of his own superiority. Yvonne's consequences arrived on a different timetable. The records surrounding my grandmother's policy were too clear to disappear after the broadcast. The forged authorization, the bank transfer, and the subsequent movement of the funds created a paper trail that years of family denial could not erase. She retained counsel and eventually cooperated. Because of the age of the conduct, her lack of a prior record, the recovered documentation, and the way the case was resolved, she did not receive the prison sentence she had feared in the hospital lobby. She received probation and financial penalties instead. For Yvonne, the legal punishment was only part of the collapse. Her social circle disappeared almost overnight. The women who had once invited her to lunches, charity events, and country club functions stopped calling. Memberships she treated as proof of her value were gone. The condo was gone. The easy access to Jamal's money was gone. She took a cashier job because she needed steady income and because reputation could no longer pay her bills. Tasha once asked whether I wanted to see a photograph someone had sent of Yvonne behind a register. I told her no. I did not need an image of my mother humiliated. What I had wanted for years was accountability. Those were not the same thing. Revenge had been the language I used when I was furious in the hospital corridor. A month later, with Zuri healing at home, I understood the difference more clearly. Their consequences were not valuable because they suffered. They were valuable because they could no longer use me as the person who absorbed the cost of their decisions. That realization changed what I wanted to do with the money returning from the liquidated portfolio. Aura Health had been born because I was a single mother trying to navigate a system that treated desperation like an administrative category. I knew exactly what it felt like to sit with a bill that might as well have been a threat. I knew the terror of choosing between rent, medication, transportation, and a specialist. I also knew that my success did not erase the fact that thousands of parents were still sitting in those same plastic chairs without a secret company waiting to save them. So I called Tasha into my office and placed a new proposal on the table. The number at the top was $50 million. It would become a philanthropic foundation, funded by a combination of Aura proceeds and money recovered through the liquidation of the debt portfolio. Its purpose was narrow-on-purpose pediatric surgical support for single-parent households facing catastrophic medical costs. We would not build another broad charity with a beautiful annual report and no urgency. We would pay for the things that decide whether a parent can actually get a child through treatment, surgical balances, required travel, temporary housing near specialty hospitals, medication gaps, and emergency support when insurance delays threatened care. Tasha read the first page, then the second. When she looked up, the hard corporate expression she wore through most negotiations was gone. "This is what you were trying to find 4 years ago," she said. "Exactly. We built the foundation around speed. Aura's platform already understood medical billing and donor matching. So we used that infrastructure to identify qualified cases without forcing exhausted parents to submit the same documents 10 times to 10 different offices. The foundation would not require a mother to turn her trauma into a performance for sympathy. If the medical need was documented and the household met the program criteria, the system would move. The first time I reviewed the launch materials, I had to close my office door because I could not stop crying. Not the helpless tears I had cried after Yvonne hung up on me. These were different. I kept thinking about the version of myself sitting on a mattress beside a sick 3-year-old, believing I had to solve everything alone because the people who should have helped me had chosen someone else's luxury over my child's safety. I could not go back and rescue that woman. But I could build something that reached the next one before she reached the same breaking point. Zuri helped me choose the final sentence for the foundation's mission page. She was home by then, still moving carefully, but getting stronger every week. I explained the idea in simple terms. We were going to help moms and dads whose kids needed big hospital care and who did not have enough money. She thought about it and asked, "So they won't have to be scared by themselves." That became the standard. Not charity for publicity. Not a family legacy built on stolen money. A system designed so fewer parents had to be terrified by themselves. The day the board approved the $50 million commitment, there were no champagne towers. Tasha and I signed the documents in the same conference room where we had reviewed hostile debt schedules weeks earlier. I looked at the signature line and thought about how much damage one forged signature had done to my life. Then I signed my own name beneath a promise that would move money in the opposite direction toward families who needed it. For the first time, the wealth connected to Jamal's collapse was no longer about taking something away. It was about creating a standard that would remain long after anyone stopped remembering his name. Segment 14. The Sweetest Victory. 6 months later, the first thing I heard when I opened the back door was Zuri laughing. She was running across the grass with the reckless confidence of a child who had finally stopped thinking about her own heartbeat. For months after surgery, every burst of energy had made me nervous. I watched her climb stairs, chase a ball, or race from one room to another, and had to fight the instinct to tell her to slow down. Dr. Sterling kept reminding me that recovery was not the same thing as fragility. Her heart was strong. She was allowed to live like a 7-year-old again. That afternoon she was proving his point. Our new home was secure, quiet, and comfortable, but I had deliberately refused to turn it into the kind of monument Jamal used to build around himself. I did not need imported stone to convince people I mattered. I needed enough room for Zuri to feel safe enough privacy that strangers could not turn our lives into entertainment, and a backyard big enough for the people who had actually stood beside us to gather without pretending to be anything other than themselves. Tasha was at the grill arguing with me about whether she had overcooked the food. A few members of the Aura team were setting plates on the outdoor table. People from the legal group who had spent that terrible night in the hospital stopped by without suits or briefcases. Nobody was networking. Nobody was measuring the value of the person beside them by a title, a house, or a bank balance. They had shown up because we had become a family through action. I noticed the difference most clearly when Zuri tripped near the edge of the patio. Before I could move, 3 people reached toward her at once. Zuri caught herself, laughed, and kept running. It was a tiny moment, almost nothing, but it made my throat tighten because I remembered the hospital group chat. Back then I had sent a photograph of a child fighting for her life and could not get 3 relatives to cross town. Now she stumbled on a patch of grass, and people moved instinctively to make sure she was all right. That was family. Not blood alone, not the name printed on an invitation, not the person who gave birth to you and then demanded loyalty after violating yours. Family was the person who answered the phone at 2 in the morning. The person who sat in an ICU without asking what they would get in return. The person who carried a garment bag, a legal file, or a paper cup of bad coffee, because those were the things you needed in that moment. I had not spoken to Jamal since the unknown number call. Everything that needed to pass between us moved through lawyers. I did not follow his life. I did not search his name. I did not ask whether he had found a new job or whether he blamed me. His opinion had controlled too much of my emotional life already. Freedom meant I no longer needed either his approval or his regret. Yvonne sent one letter through counsel several months after her probation began. I read it once. She wrote that she was ashamed. She wrote that she had spent her life believing Jamal's success would make the entire family secure, and that she had convinced herself taking my inheritance was justified because he would eventually repay everyone. She wrote that losing her social world forced her to see how much of her identity depended on being associated with a successful son. I did not answer. Maybe one day, Zuri would ask questions, and I would decide what kind of contact, if any, was safe. But forgiveness was not the same thing as access. I could let go of hatred without reopening the door that had nearly crushed us. My peace did not require a reunion scene. The foundation gave me a healthier place to put my attention. In its first months, it approved support for families facing the same impossible math I once faced. I reviewed the reports without names whenever possible because I did not want gratitude to become another kind of performance. What mattered was that surgeries happened on schedule, parents found temporary housing, and children went home with medication their families could afford. Aura Health continued to grow, but the numbers that stayed with me were no longer valuation headlines. They were cases closed before a parent reached desperation. As the sun lowered over the backyard, Zuri ran toward me holding a paper plate with a piece of cake that had tilted dangerously to one side. She climbed onto the seat beside me and asked whether we could make this barbecue an every-year thing. I told her yes. Only the good family, she asked. I smiled. Only the people who know how to show up. She seemed satisfied with that definition and immediately went back to her cake. Tasha sat down across from me a few minutes later. For once, neither of us had a tablet in front of us. She looked around the yard and said, "You know, this is the first party you've hosted where nobody is trying to impress anybody. That was the point." We watched Zuri race across the grass again. 6 months earlier, I had stood alone under fluorescent hospital lights, wondering whether I would ever see her wake up. In the same hour, the people who shared our blood had treated her possible death like an interruption to a celebration. I used to think the victory was what happened at 10 o'clock that night, when Jamal dropped his glass and the truth appeared on a giant screen. It was not. The sweetest victory was this ordinary afternoon. My daughter was alive. My home was peaceful. My work had purpose. The people around me did not need to be threatened, exposed, or paid to care. Nothing in the yard belonged to a performance. If there is one thing I learned, it is that family is not defined by who is connected to you on paper. It is defined by who holds your hand when the waiting room is cold, who believes your pain without demanding proof, and who refuses to turn your vulnerability into leverage. Blood can explain where you came from. It does not get unlimited permission to decide where you are going. I also learned that building in silence is not the same thing as hiding forever. There is a season for protecting your work from people who would sabotage it, and there is a season for standing in the light with the receipts in your hand. I did not win because I screamed louder than my family. I won because when the moment came, I had facts, ownership, evidence, and a life that no longer depended on their version of me. So if you are working in the dark right now, keep building. Protect your documents. Learn the system that is being used against you. Do not confuse temporary loneliness with permanent powerlessness. And when success finally gives you choices, use some of that power to create the help you once needed. Zuri called my name from the middle of the yard. I looked up and saw her waving both arms, impatient for me to come join the game. I stood, left the phone on the table, and went to my daughter. For years, I thought my loudest answer to my family would be the night I exposed them on national television. I was wrong. My loudest answer was the life we built after I stopped asking them to love us.